Hello all and welcome to ETV, our weekly special program. In today's episode, I met Professor Ezrah Aharone. He is a professor at University of America as well. He's an author, same time he's a founder of Center for Global Africa. We are going to talk about topics of African issue. Please do stay with us. I am Ugayo Mulina with the program. Well, Professor Ezrah Aharone, you are an author, you are a university lecturer in various universities of the United States of America. At the same time, you are the founder of Center for Global Africa. But for now, let me talk about this. What is the objective of the Center for Global Africa? How does it connect with the sense of, or with the sentiment of Pan-Africanism? Could you please describe that?
Okay, well, thank you for that. It's a lot in your question. But if you look at America and you look at education, you'll find that coming out of slavery in America for Africans who were there in the 1860s didn't have a place to be educated on a university level. So what happened is that there were established what we call historically black colleges and universities that were specifically intended for Africans to attend. So today we have over 100 of those such institutions, historically black colleges and universities, or what we call HBCUs. So I attended an HBCU, Hampton University in Virginia, and now I teach at Delaware State University in Dover, Delaware, which is an HBCU. But in between the time, I've lived and worked in West Africa most of my adult life. And so the Center for Global Africa is a direct extension of my life experiences and work in Africa. And I conceptualize the Center for Global Africa to be a think tank that works with our historically black colleges and universities as drivers of intellectual capital, to work with our industry partners, to connect with African universities and private sector partners to assist in African development. So we work in a systems approach way to connect counterparts so that the intellectual capital of our historically black colleges and universities are directly linked to African development, that we are looking for African nations to open up, to understand that when you talk about African problems and African solutions in the diaspora or the sixth region, we have a lot of intellectual capital to contribute to that process. So the Center for Global Africa is a means by which we translate that intellectual capital into real-time development. And so we're here at the African Union now. And if you look on the walls of this great building, you'll see that it has the presidents from the beginning of African independence on up to today. So 3 of those presidents are products of historically black colleges and universities. Osajifo Dr. Nkrumah, first president of Ghana, is a product of Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. Nnamdi Azikiwe, first president of Nigeria, a product of Lincoln University as well as Howard University in Washington, D.C. And then Hastings Banda, the first president of Malawi, is a product of an HBCU known as Meharry Medical College. So we have this rich history that's already connected to Africa as our universities and colleges that we reinvigorate to be able to put to bring to Africa this rich history that we want to facilitate development. So that's the origin of what gives the Center for Global Africa its uniqueness, its pedigree, and relevance in terms of how we can assist in African development.
Well, Professor, you have attended the meeting or the ministerial meeting that undertook yesterday. How do you value the meeting, especially in solving African problems?
Okay, great. And that brings us to another dimension of the Center for Global Africa, because as an HBCU institution, we have a partnership with the African Union, which is what brought us here today. And so our partnership is with the African Peer Review Mechanism, which is an agency of the African Union that evaluates governance. And so the Center for Global Africa, our mandate focuses on governance, policy, socioeconomic development that relates to African priorities in relation to Agenda 2063. And so our presence here is as a six-region institution to help facilitate Agenda 2063, working directly with African nations and their priorities. So when you're talking about African solutions to African problems, as I said, the Center for Global Africa is a means by which we harness and bring together as a convening power the diaspora six-region entities that can help facilitate in that process. So we are an intermediary that link to African nations, and we're doing a lot of work now in Sierra Leone as part of that process, which we can talk about. But it's a great pleasure to be here because, you know, we're with decision makers, and decisions can be made to transform, redirect, and bring about the types of changes that are necessary for Africa to reach Agenda 2063. So it all begins with an idea, a great idea, decision making, you know, and so we have to examine the ideas that we have, that we're looking at, that we hold the great weight in to, you know, be transformative. So we're happy and we're glad to be here to engage in that process.
Well, Professor, I know and understand that you carried out several activities in the United States of America, especially in fighting racism and in equalizing the rights of the black people. So could you please tell us major activities you have been undertaking so far in the United States of America?
Well, you know, racism has been pervasive in America since the end of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. You know, and one of the things that we focus on is, you know, how do we, as intellectuals, as scholars, as think tanks, how do we create the environment that's going to change the conditions that, as I said, bring about the ideas that have the weight to make transformative changes. So at the Center for Global Africa, as a think tank, you know, what we do is to bring about the convening of the best minds that can take on these challenges. So one of the things we did, we created the Martin Delaney Distinguished Fellowship. So the audience can read about Delaney because, you know, his life, even though it's basically unknown, it's recorded in a lot of deep ways. And so we have this Delaney Fellowship where we work with the best and brightest of thought leaders. And the APRM APRM CEO, Dr. Eddie Maloka, is our first founding fellow of that fellowship. And so we create the environment. We set the tone for bringing the conveners together for solution-oriented ideas.
Well, Professor, what's your recommendation or what's expected from the leaders of African heads of state or leaders, especially to bring about the sustainable and peaceful Africa that we demand to see?
Thank you for that. You know, there's joint advocacy that we need to do, Africa and the diaspora, to empower each other. And so on the African side, there's an advocacy that needs to take place so that African governments are making it clear and decisive that the diaspora must be involved in the process of what happens in Africa. So, you know, you have corporate capitalism, you have the gigantic companies that do things all over the world, and that's fine. And they bring good on several levels. At the same time, there's a role that the diaspora can play. If you look at remittances alone, the billions in remittances, it tells you an important story, because each of those individuals have a skill set, they're professionals, they're very successful in some form or some fashion. So we need to understand and examine the sources of those monies, because the sources of those monies represent additional resources that could and should be harnessed. And so when you're talking about the role of Africans in terms of being able to advocate, it's critically important that we see that value proposition that comes with the diaspora. If the diaspora can be a source of billions of dollars of remittances, then the question becomes, what else can the diaspora do in terms of the professionalism, the expertise that resides within the diaspora? So we look for African nations, African leaders to embrace, that potential. And so at the Center for Global Africa, as we work with APRM, we produce review reports on governance and make recommendations. And within those recommendations, there are implementation steps that must take place. And so as a diaspora, we bring great value added to what can come in terms of producing these implementations that are going to advance and accelerate Agenda 2063. So there's a systems approach that we need to strengthen that's going to directly tie the diaspora, the resources, the expertise into African nations. So you take the work we do in Sierra Leone to create models of excellence in the same capacity building way, so that those models of excellence can be scaled and replicated in other African nations, so that we have this systems approach that works. So, ultimately, intellect, one of the measures of intellect is how well you solve problems. So what are we being educated, and, what is our intellect producing? And it has to have one of these telltale measurements of real development. So that's the messaging that I think is critically important coming out of here, that African nations and leaders would benefit from, by seeing this new vision of the diaspora and the role that we could play, that the Center for Global Africa is leading.
Well, Professor, finally, let me give you a chance for you if you have any message you'd like to say.
Well, I appreciate it, because I think dialogue like this needs to happen more. So, there should be a strong media component to Agenda 2063, to these summits, because we need to have these simulcast ways of being able to tell this story from African perspectives, from a six-region perspective, so that young people get excited about these relationships, get excited about Pan-Africanism, get excited about the possibilities of, this growing youth population in Africa, that some may see as a growing market economy. We have to see it as the future of Africa, and be able to harness the best resources and ideas that are going to create these mutually beneficial pathways for Africa and the diaspora to have this systems approach that, once again, that the Center for Global Africa is leading. So I appreciate this opportunity to sit with you and look to engage even further.
Well, Professor, once again, I'd like to appreciate for your time to have an exclusive interview with me.
Appreciate you. Thank you.
Well, viewers, this concludes a special program I have conducted with Professor Ezrah Aharone, who is founder of Center for Global Africa. We have raised very critical points in terms of our incarnation with African topics. I hope I'll meet him some other time, but for now, this concludes my program for today. I am Wagayo Bulana. Please do stay with other programs of ATV. Have a nice time.